While the panel's coming up, I just want to remind all of you, after this panel's over, we're going to have some questions from the audience. And you can submit your questions to the hashtag Blueprint for Schools via Twitter, okay? So while everyone's coming up, I'm going to introduce you all quickly. To my right, that's Lynn Kagan. She's the Virginia and Leonard Marks Professor of Early Childhood Education and Family Policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families at Teachers College at Columbia University. Just a few weeks ago, with NCEE support right here, Lynn released a major new international comparative study on early childhood education and care funded by NCEE called The Early Advantage. You can find that report and access to that book on NCEE's website. Paul Reville is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Educational Policy Administration at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He was the former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts and chaired the Massachusetts State Board of Education. Paul also chaired the Massachusetts Commission on Time and Learning. Craig Rice, to my far left, is a member of the Montgomery County Council in Maryland, a member of the Kirwan Commission, and a former member of the Maryland General Assembly. Craig chairs the Council's Education Committee, and he chairs the Maryland Association of Counties Education Subcommittee. Craig was the chair of the Kirwan Commission's working group on early childhood education that Britt just talked about, one of the working groups. And finally, Joy Schaefer is the vice president of the Frederick County Board of Education and a member of the Kirwan Commission, where she represents now the 24 Maryland school boards for the Maryland Association for Boards of Education. Joy was the chair of the Kirwan Commission's working group called More Resources for At-Risk Students. So we're going to start with Lynn.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and congratulations to all of you who worked so hard on this momentous report. It has been said that the mark of a good blueprint is that it is very long on vision, that it is very rich in strategy, and that it is embedded in data. I would suggest that the Kirwan Commission has all three of those criteria, and these are especially manifest in the first set of recommendations regarding the care and education of young children and their families. I've been invited to discuss those recommendations predicated on our international analysis of best practices around the world for very, very young children. Let me submit to you that the Maryland Commission has taken the Early Advantage, the name of the report that we just released, in that it incorporates all of these three criteria and that it is first in the nation, indeed, to do so. Given the importance of strategy to this report, I'd like to focus on several key strategies in the early childhood area and talk with you about some antecedents that exist for them in other high-performing countries in the world. First, this report does a splendid job of recommending full day, and I want to underscore that, full day, high-quality pre-kindergarten programs for 3-year-old children and 4-year-old children who are at 300% of poverty, with a great number of subsidies for children above the poverty range. This is called progressive universalism in the jargon of other countries. It is exemplified in leading nations for early childhood programs, notably Hong Kong, Singapore, and indeed in South Korea, where universal services for 0 to 5-year-olds prevail. A second recommendation of the Kirwan report is that all entering kindergartners will be assessed with culturally relevant assessments for readiness, and that those data will be used for program planning. England is notable in our study, and it is what distinguishes it, because indeed it does collect data on very young children, and it uses those data to inform policy, both pedagogically within classrooms and programs, but also at the national level Finland has an individualized education plan based on exactly the kind of assessment that the Kirwan Commission recommends. The third recommendation takes into tremendous consideration the need to support quality services with a strong infrastructure and devotes a delicious amount of energy and effort to tuition assistance to staff and to teachers who are working and hope to work in early childhood settings. This models itself after work that has been done in Singapore and again in South Korea. In addition to being concerned about quality teaching, the Kirwan report is very concerned about quality programs and focuses on supporting accreditation processes that lead to those quality programs. Notably, this same focus on program quality is evidenced in virtually all of the countries which we studied, with notable accomplishments in Australia, England, Singapore, and South Korea. And the Kirwan Commission really does understand that services to young children don't just happen when they are 3 and 4-year-olds, but uniquely it focuses on needs of infants and toddlers and the needs of families, and has manifest itself in the support of the Judy Centers and the family support centers that have existed in Maryland and that are being so elegantly built upon. In closing, let me suggest to you that this report really does set a vision and builds upon the major findings that we discerned. Notably, it builds on the unique Maryland context. And I want to acknowledge the leadership role that Maryland has taken historically in its Judy Centers and in its pioneering work on the kindergarten entry assessment. These are being built upon with the Kirwan Commission report. The second finding is that Maryland is pursuing multiple bests. In our study, we found that no one country does exactly the same thing to achieve high-quality early childhood services for young children. Maryland has acknowledged that. Indeed, it has focused on infants and toddlers. It has focused on family support and on 3-year-olds, congratulations on that, and of course on 4-year-olds. And finally, the final recommendation of our major early advantage study was that there needs to be, as Mark so eloquently stated, synergy amongst the various policies that exist. And I'm so proud that the Kirwan Commission report has attended not only to the direct services that children receive, but to the infrastructure to build up quality in the teachers and in the programs that are provided. In my mind, the Kirwan Commission really positions Maryland to take the early advantage on behalf of all of its young children and families. So hats off to you all who've worked on it, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Apparently I'm sitting on a microphone. We won't get into that. Okay. Well, I was going to start to say something much more elevated, so let me go back to high elevation. Number one, it's an honor to be on this panel with so many premier people, whether it's Lynn in early childhood or Britt in higher education, whether it's Mark Tucker, who's a gift to the nation, one of our foremost education thinkers, and then two of my personal heroes, David Driscoll, who really embodies doing education reform with the field rather than to the field, and a leader in how to make state reform actually happen at the local level. And finally, a long-term, 3 decades hero of mine, David Hornbeck, who is the, in my view, the premier civil rights education advocate in the nation. So I'm honored to be part of such a group. 2013, when I left the role of the State Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, looked in my rearview mirror driving away from Beacon Hill, I was really proud of what we'd achieved. All of us have achieved working together in Massachusetts. All kinds of first place finishes. Doing well, as I said when I was in office, wasn't good enough. when we looked at those first place finishes, and they were all based on averages, and we started to look at the gaps, which have already been referenced this morning, those gaps were shocking. We had millions, we had tens of thousands of children who were still caught in the achievement gap, nowhere near ready for success. We still had, as all of our states have, an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational attainment and achievement. We had very high ideals that we expressed in terms of all means all, or every child a winner, or later in the federal language, no child left behind, or every student succeeds. And it was apparent, despite the big investments that some of our states like Massachusetts had made, despite the huge effort that people in the field had made, despite the unrelenting focus on school optimization, we had failed at the fundamental mission of all means all. It wasn't that it was the wrong goal, either for ethical or practical economic reasons. It was still the right goal. It wasn't that the strategies were wrong, our focus on standards, assessment, accountability, choice, data, improving teaching, turning around chronic school underperformance. All those things were important to the world of schooling, necessary but insufficient to getting the job done. But it was basically the system, designed in another era for another purpose. And really, as I came back to Harvard, what was foremost in my mind was that we needed to do a system redesign. So I established something called the Education Redesign Lab at Harvard, which is committed to sort of taking the Model T that we've managed to move from 30 miles an hour up to 60 miles an hour by tinkering with it, and transforming it into a 21st century Tesla capable of going 120 miles an hour. It's a much different engine, and we have to design that engine. And this is new work. It's work some other states and other nations have done. I believe that work really starts at the local level. I am troubled that we're in kind of a stall in terms of education reform right now. We've got a lot of pushback on reforms that have happened to date. We've got a lack of leadership really at the federal, national level. We've got many distracted governors. You can't find CEOs and governors who want to be associated with education anymore. This work happens at the local level, but it will only happen if there's a state framework there to begin to define what it is that can be done by locals in terms of responding to these standards. So I love this report. I think it takes that state role. If Kentucky established a framework for school reform, and Massachusetts established the leadership in terms of implementing it, this is now defining a leadership role in the next generation of what constitutes education reform in this nation. And so I've listed quickly a dozen things that I really like about it. And the first, I can't avoid reading some of the language here just briefly, because it's the language, it's the conception of the problem. As we conceived the problem in the early days of education reform, it was one of school optimization. Schools constitute 20% of a child's waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12. This report begins to take a much larger view of what goes into the lives of children from birth to getting a job, 365 days a year, 360 degrees around. It says, this last recommendation acknowledges that many economically disadvantaged students are not receiving the critical social services, healthcare, behavioral, mental health, nutritional, and other needs that students from more affluent families receive as a matter of course. It acknowledges these students are living in neighborhoods where they experience traumas that are going untreated. While it should not be the schools or the school finance system's responsibility to provide these services, the Commission recognizes that students cannot learn properly if these needs continue to go unaddressed. So it's language like this suffused through, and I have several other passages, but not time to read them, that make this point that it's the whole child. It's not just curriculum and instruction, though those are centrally important. Those are necessary to success, and we have to work on improving them. God knows we spend enough money on schools. But if we don't be attentive to the needs of children from birth going forward, we can't get there. So that language is critically important. Second thing, it enables the community to sort of draw up a new social compact. And it says that the community and the state level are the central place where this work happens. It points to poverty as really mattering. It's not an excuse. for performance, but it's a reality. Students face significant disadvantages. We have a correlation between socioeconomic status and achievement and attainment. And if we don't recognize that as a factor in terms of what we need to do to meet children where they are, to give them what they need inside and outside of school to succeed, we can't possibly compete with the most advanced countries. It advances this idea of customization and the utilization of more time. If you come to school having had significantly less in the way of enrichment or vocabulary than other students, we know the game is over before it even starts. So if we don't take into account the additional time that young people need, if they don't have the kind of support and enrichment that affluent children have outside of school, then there's no way we're going to get them on the same playing field as more privileged students. The college and career pathways, I happen to think, is the best way to bring the business community back into this work. And while Mark is right in saying we shouldn't just focus at that end of the continuum, it needs to begin much earlier. At the same time, making high school more meaningful, connecting the world of work to the world of school is clearly a way that many other jurisdictions have found to lead this work. The sixth thing that is important is it attends to the specific needs of English language learners and special needs children. Nowhere is it more evident the lack of common sense that we expect people who don't know English to be pushed into inclusion situations, catch up in core subjects, keep pace with other students, learn English and assimilate to American culture all at the same time, and it's not working out. So we need to do something about that. It's attentive to improving instruction in a variety of ways and into improving the quality of teaching and attracting people to the profession. But it doesn't say that this is the only thing, but it says that it's really important and it does something about it. It sees the family as important and the family support centers, and this is multi-generational work, and it acknowledges that. It makes the point that Lynn has underlined, so I won't, about early childhood. It acknowledges race, culture, and diversity as critical ingredients to success. Unlike other plans, it's a real blueprint. It costs this out, makes clear the financial commitments, and has a plan. It's realistic. And finally, it's practical. It specifies design assumptions and next steps, and it attends, although this is difficult and I think will be challenging even with the model you've devised, to work out these governance and accountability questions. So right now this is just a report, although you've had a sort of early down payment on it. It's a powerful one and it's a clarion call to action. If you make this happen, I think Maryland will surely become the nation's education reform, child development leader, and that's a really important role. If Kentucky got us started and Massachusetts made it happen, you're going to lead us into the next generation of this reform, and I'm very proud to be associated with that.
Thank you so much.
So my mother always taught me when it's clear that folks are in support, you should just shut up. So as the chair of the working group on early childhood education, I can't tell you how much it means to hear experts who have been doing this work for a very long time tell you about how the work product that you put forth is something that really meets the goal of what we were trying to accomplish. And so I just want to tell you about what this means. You've heard about some of the nuts and bolts of what this is, but what it's going to accomplish, I think, is what's very important. And I'll tell you just a very quick story. I was at the gym the other day, and a gentleman who's very involved, always telling me, Craig, about this and about that, what's wrong with the county, came up to me and he said, "You guys did the right thing." And I said, "Kevin, what do you mean?" He said, "You guys are focusing on early childhood education." And I said, "Oh, I'd never heard him talk about this issue." And I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "I'm going to tell you about the difference between my son and my niece. Both of them are in 2nd grade. My wife and I decided to put our son in an early childhood education program that we paid for. It was expensive, but it was very high quality. My niece, on the other hand, spent her pre-K days with her grandfather at home in a caring and nurturing environment, but one in which she did not have that same academic rigor. And he says, when I look at them playing together, I see the stark difference, and the gap is already there. That's striking because we have folks in our community who see it and understand it every day and are embracing it. When we did a survey in the state of Maryland and found out that 75% of Marylanders support early childhood education and expansion for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, folks know and understand how important this is. And so just as you heard from Paul, the reality is this is a blueprint, but we've got to take this, folks, across the finish line. And so as an elected official, it really is one where this is that call to action, where we're going to need all of our advocates throughout our communities as a whole who understand just how important this is to say this is a defining moment for us. Because when you want to talk about the equity, opportunity, achievement gaps that exist in our schools, it starts with early childhood education access and the quality of it. Because we all know that there are programs out there that people are sending their children to that are not giving them that same academic rigor, that don't have the curricula that's there to support it, the wraparound services that are there, the early identification if children have learning disabilities and being able to address those and give them the supports. All of those things we know are encompassed in a high quality early childhood education setting. And we need to make sure, something that was pointed out before also, we need to make sure that we're also evaluating how these programs are doing and ensuring that we get that feedback. Because this is not about testing our kids. I want to be very clear about that. What this is about is making sure that it is meeting the needs of our children. What we don't want to do is be putting money into a program that's not giving us what we need and continuing to exacerbate the existing gaps that we have. That would be a big mistake. And so from my perspective, I think that we found ourselves in a great place, but one that's also very scary. As a person who has worked at both the state level as a state representative and now as a local elected official, it's one in which folks are scared about the price tag. But the reality is we have to keep reminding people that this is not about what you can afford, but what you cannot afford not to do. Because I'm going to tell you right now, the crime, the health disparities, the lack of economic development, investment, and the challenges that we're seeing all across our community are all tied directly to education. And it all starts with that early access. So I'm going to stop there because I know that we have some questions that are going to be had, but I just want to close with saying one thing and ask for your help. This is going to require us as a state to make this happen. And so all of you that may have contacts and connections with all of your elected officials, we should be writing and talking to them about this, just like we're talking about climate change, just like we're talking about anything else that is of global importance. I had the fortunate situation of being able to go to South Korea. And so when you talk about some of the weaving in of South Korea, I had a chance to meet with their Minister of Education and tour and look at their schools and their programming. And that's the reason why a lot of those recommendations are in there. This is incredibly important. We on the commission, staff, NCEE, spent so much time in making sure that this was truly something that was representative of making a change and a difference in our education system as a whole. We cannot let all of that work go for naught. And so us together, we collectively can make this happen. I don't think there's going to be some leading force, unfortunately, in this case, that's going to push us across the finish line. This has got to be a collective effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Joy?
So I just want to start by talking about, just to get back to what Britt was pointing out in terms of breaking us up into work groups and how that affected our work. And I'll highlight a couple of the things that came out of the work group of more resources for at-risk students in a second that are unique, I think, to our recommendations and to approaches other states have used. But that work group framework not only gave ownership to the commissioners, I don't know about you and the other two work group leaders, but for months I just had a knot in my stomach, just driving around with a knot in my stomach and thinking, but it also gave us the opportunity in those smaller groups. My work group had very, very vocal and passionate and very knowledgeable advocates come. And we were able to use that small space and that time to really dig deeply into, when we're talking about at-risk students, what do they actually need? And we heard from people on the ground that are providing those every single day to students that have stories you probably would not believe. So we used all of that knowledge to make sure that we were setting aside the kind of resources that schools and districts would be able to use to serve those students. So one of those was community schools and enough funding to at least have a health professional, and if they wanted to start a school-based health center, a community school that would take a needs assessment, that would see what that school community needed, not just those students, but their families, in order to send students, strong students, to school. And strong students are not high achieving academically, perfect students. Strong students are kids that are fed, they get enough sleep, they have health care and dental care and glasses that they need, they have safe routes to school or a safe way to get to school, they have a caring environment and an environment that is optimal for learning, natural light and art on the wall, and all kinds of things that come together to allow instruction to take place and then allow students to access that instruction. And that's what more resources for at-risk kids translates to in terms of policy and in terms of allocating funding. And I just want to get back to a couple of the things we used as a foundation for our discussion in our work group, which was at-risk being at promise. And we really talked as a work group and a commission about that at-risk terminology. So we talked about students at promise, meaning every single student has promise. And it is our job as a school system to unlock the promise of each of those students. But it also spoke to the promise of educators, school systems, districts, in order to fulfill that promise to our students. And the at-risk resources that we are committed to providing fulfills that promise to each and every student. And the foundation of all of that was a commitment to equity. And we really took that in our work group in terms of providing educational equity, which means providing students what they need when they need it. And we also talked about racial equity, which is something that is a huge issue, I know, in the state of Maryland and all over this country. And that's why we talked a lot about infusing the teacher prep program with cultural proficiency, and talked about how we create that kind of equity within our school buildings. But that brings us to the notion of, and a few people have touched on it here, how we are just education is just part of the larger whole. So we can talk about equity, educational equity, we can talk about racial equity within the school building walls, but we exist within a community. And part of the accountability is not just the school system's accountability and the school district's accountability, and then the state and local's accountability in terms of funding, but it's also our shared accountability for creating an environment where families can thrive and then where students can thrive, and that it adds to the conversation about how do we frame this moving forward so that we have the support that we need, because it is going to take additional resources. And how do we frame that conversation so that everybody is committed to every student in Maryland? Because a student in Maryland is one of our students, everybody in this room, everybody in Maryland, and that's part of, elected officials have a lot of ability to do that, but it's how we frame that going forward, because these resources are not inexpensive. And a lot of the things that we're asking schools to do are labor intensive as well. So we need the support of everybody in our community. We have to come at this with being able to frame the discussion so everybody understands the benefit to themselves, their students, and the community as a whole. So it's a shared accountability that school systems are very comfortable with, but we're happy to extend to our county government, our health professionals, law enforcement. Everybody is responsible for every student in this state. And I think that's where the power of these additional resources for the students who really need them, that's what resonated with us on our work group, and that's what we hope is communicated through the report as well as in our discussions in public. And I just think it's really appropriate that we're here talking about this on D-Day, because you had a situation where allies came together and they turned the tide of World War II. And I feel like right now we're at war with a lot of barriers that our students are facing and their families are facing in order to access the education program we have now. So now is the time for all of our allies in this room and outside to come together and make sure that we are providing for the students that really need our help, and we can actually turn that tide for them as well.
Can't thank you all. We have a few minutes for one question. We all know that there's been a down payment to implement the recommendations in this commission's report, but there needs to be additional revenue in order to fulfill the vision. So can you each give us one idea for how to build the public support to get that accomplished?
Let me start. I remember making a presentation that had many of the same elements that I talked about today, that you talk about in this report, to Secretary Arne Duncan and his senior staff several years ago. And when I was done, the Secretary had one key question, which was, where is the demand for this going to come from? So I think part of the work of building public will is to build public demand, which looks a lot like, for the state, what I think Britt described as the work of the commission. How do you get people engaged and have a sense of ownership and a belief that it's reasonable for them as families, as citizens, to demand a new kind of social compact, a new kind of social contract in society, that this is reasonable, that it's doable, and more importantly, that it's imperative to our economical survival and to the survival of the democracy. So I think that's a good place to start. I think it was touched on earlier how important business leadership and the economic argument is. I think those arguments are still as relevant, updated, as they were 20 and 30 years ago. But I think this building public demand and a new social compact is a place to begin.
So I'll jump in, I guess, as the elected official who, actually, when I was in the state, we raised the state sales tax from 5% to 6%. Trust me, I have a lot of opponents who continue to remind me of that every election. And there was a will because we knew that there were so many things that were before us that we needed to fund to take Maryland to the next level. And I think that that's the reason why I continue to tie education to every single thing that is important to Marylanders as a whole, because they are all connected. And we need to start answering the question when folks say, well, what are you doing about police reform? Well, I'm investing in education. Well, what are you doing about healthcare and health disparities? Well, I'm investing in education. Well, what are you doing about climate change and what's happening in our environment? Well, I'm investing in education. All of those kinds of things are tied, and if we can change the paradigm to where folks truly understand that all of the things that are pressing us, that concern us as a society, are directly tied to quality education for all, then we will be successful. in making sure that we build that groundswell. That's how we get those allies. They all care about individual pieces, but they have not yet come together to resonate around the understanding that they are all connected. And we have to keep telling that story and making sure that folks understand just how connected they truly are. There is no space between any of those other things that we care about in those issues and education.
I'll just add one thing, and because, you know, I know that education is not political, but I would say elections. So this framing is important, but and because it molds public discussion. So elect folks that can frame this discussion this way. Pay attention, and then, you know what? You as individuals can bring these ideas forward and can bring this framing forward to people who are running and then support those people. And today, it's not enough to vote. You must donate. You must donate hours, your time, your resources in terms of monetary resources, and then talk to 5 people you wouldn't normally talk to about that candidate. That is how you get somebody elected that wants to make a change and that understands the challenges that we have to overcome in order to get to where we need to go.
In addition to the wise words of my co-panelists, I would remind everyone that there are lessons from the emergence of early childhood, from babysitting to a requisite essential to the platform of education in our country and in many countries around the world. And it was done by 2 things. Number one, we had a very rich scientific base that justified the legitimacy of early childhood, and I would submit to you that in the Kirwan report, there is that scientific base. Secondly, we had examples of very fine programs that could actually enliven the database in reality, and the fact that indeed this report has benchmarked from samples around the country suggests that what we are doing, while it is visionary, it is also very, very doable. So I would encourage us to use those strategies as we move forward to generate public will.
Round of applause for the panel. We're going to move on to some questions from the audience that Tony's going to take. So we'll sit up here.
Yes, please do stay there because there's some questions for you. Rachel, there's a question that I'm going to give you a little bit of advance notice on, so that I'll come back to you. But let me begin, and I thank you very much. If I can pass that microphone to you. Let me see if I can do justice to half a dozen questions by condensing them into 2. And the first goes to the early years. So, Lynn and Craig, here's the essence, I think, of some of the feedback we're getting. We now know, Lynn, that early years has been brought into sharp relief internationally. If there's ever been a time when there's been focus on the early years, it's now, and a real sense of promise. And the focus on the whole person, as I think Paul articulated, is something that people now see as being absolutely fundamental and vital from the start. The question is, Mark, when you talk about the system and you talk about the importance of sequencing, we are getting people saying to us, we want you to intensify the effort and accelerate the effort on the early years now. Do you agree that that is what we need to do? And give us a quick word about how you do that when you're also simultaneously looking at an entire blueprint. You're looking at a plan that has to be practical. So there's a question about prioritising here that people are trying to ask you to press on a bit. Lynn? Ladies first.
Okay. Well, obviously, I wouldn't be here, nor would you, nor would many of us if we didn't think that the early years are critically important, if not certainly a priority in the educational and development of our young children. I would suggest, and I do want to congratulate the Commission on this, you have been very wise in not only provisioning for the proliferation of direct services for children and families, notably services for 3-year-old children, very notable, for 4-year-old children, and for the Judy Centers. But you have taken care to make sure that those services will be of quality, because if we've learned anything, investing in low-quality programs yields us nothing. And so the fact that you have guarded the infrastructure, that you have provision for teacher quality, for program quality via accreditation, and for the development of a data-driven approach to quality improvement, both for teachers and for entire programs in schools, really matters. So I think you've got the fundamental ingredients to move this agenda forward in a way that makes eminent sense and actually is quite doable.
So let me just say, it's very interesting because all of the recommendations are interwoven together.
Yeah.
And so it makes it very difficult to then say, well, I'm just going to move early childhood education, because part of those recommendations involve recommendations that came from supports for some of our at-promise, at-risk students. Also came to high-quality teachers and ensuring that we have high-quality teachers that are in front of our early childhood education students. The same when it comes to ensuring that we've got the supports that are necessary when it comes to wraparound services for those children, extended options for longer school years. All of those things are encompassed, so they truly work together, so I cannot pull one out. It's one of my conversations that I want to have with our governor and say to him that you can't just pick one. While it seems sexy to pick, because 75% of Marylanders say, I believe in early childhood education, well, the recommendations in true fidelity are all combined together. They are interwoven, and that is why this blueprint is so strong, because the only way in which we will be able to lift our system to that level is to ensure that all of those things are working simultaneously.
Got it. Thank you. Paul and Joy, here is a fusion of about 3 different questions, okay? It goes to the role of government, the state framework, Paul, yeah. The importance of the local, the way in which districts and schools will be partners in this reform agenda. And it goes to the earlier conversation about tight and loose that we heard in the first panel. So I'm going to ask each of you if you could respond to this. How do we get this right? How do we get a state framework that's not just about education, but whole of government services, with enough clarity, but at the same time to give those stakeholders and those professionals the latitude that they need within their contexts to be able to drive that implementation to achieve the goals that we've set? What is that sense of balance there, and how does that read across into accountability? Paul?
Well, I think the first requirement is leadership. In other words, you have to have leadership at the top that conceives of this more holistic vision that's intra-governmental, it's interdepartmental. So it would be a mistake to think of this only in terms of the traditional education lines of authority and bureaucracy. In Massachusetts, we created a children's cabinet, a child and youth development cabinet, which brought together cabinet secretaries of all the relevant departments, HHS, housing, criminal justice, things of this nature, to begin to work at the state level, or how are we going to better coordinate in an interagency way to build, what's essentially a new architecture. I mean, when we start with the individual child, we're saying, how do we figure out how to create public systems to do for all children what those of us who have privilege do for our own?
Yep.
Because that's the way we get to high levels of success. So what does that architecture look like? This report begins to say, well, it's more than just a school architecture. So it would be a mistake to put this all on the school structure and say, you get it all done. It's got to be an intergovernmental, cross-sector kind of framework. So you've got to be thinking in those terms, and you need a leader who has that vision and is willing to hold people accountable to making it happen.
Thank you. Joy.
And just to add to that, there has to be a framework and a mechanism for school systems and locals to communicate up. Because when you have the state system, you know, all these high-performing systems that we've compared ourselves to have a very strong centralized system. That's just not our culture. That's just not the way it works in Maryland. I don't know how many times I've talked to people on the shore or on the west part of the state that are like, you can't tell me. So we have to grapple with that and figure out what the mechanism then is, because the advocacy that we need begins at the local level. So if everything's coming from the top down, you're only going to get half of the buy-in coming from the bottom up. So it's really important to include that local voice and create some kind of formal mechanism by which there is communication back and forth.
Rachel, I'm going to suggest we hold your question, because I think in some ways it will be addressed in the next session post-morning tea. So that gives you even more notice. Colleagues, at this point, could you join with me in thanking our remarkable panel? And can I indicate to those online that we are giving those in the room a very generous 14.5 minutes to have some morning tea, and then we'll return. Thank you very much.